It's hard to look back and say I wish something was different because I can't imagine having had a better life.
Hmm.
And my concern is if we had that discussion, it would have screwed everything up. And that's not what I wanted.
Welcome to Vulnerability Muscle, the inspiring podcast challenging norms and helping you redefine vulnerability as a strength. I'm your host, Reggie D. Ford. Each episode of Vulnerability Muscle dives into a variety of topics such as mental health, social issues, and mindset shifts. We explore the power of vulnerability in fostering meaningful connections, healing, building resilience, and promoting personal growth. Sometimes these conversations are uncomfortable, but good workouts often are. So join us and flex that vulnerability muscle. Welcome to this episode of Vulnerability Muscle. I'm your host, Reggie D. Ford. In this episode, we have my man, Ed Di Gangi. Ed was adopted at birth in New York City. An only child, he made no effort to explore his hereditary until at the age of 69 with a visit to the cemetery where members of his adoptive mother's family were buried stirred his interest. Over the past 8 years, through extensive archival research and DNA testing, Ed has peeled back the layers of his once unknown family and has revealed still more questions seeking to be answered. Ed is an author. He's authored the book The Gift Best Given, where he is set in the 1940s as America emerges from the Great Depression and went to war, where he recounts the search for the identity of his birth mother and tells the story of a young woman's courage as she overcame obstacles to achieve her dreams. Ed has another book coming out this June, Gliding Through Goodbye. It continues to detail his birth mother's journey, physical and emotional, as she traveled the United States, South America, and Europe in the years after his birth and subsequent adoption. Ed and his wife Linda live in Hillsborough, North Carolina. Their son James and his wife Renee are expecting their first child in May. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And live in nearby Durham. Ed Di Gangi, welcome. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join you, Reggie. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you and taking the time to share your phenomenal story. I mean, just from that description alone, it's very captivating. And I can't wait to hear all of what you've uncovered with your self discovery, with your family discovery. I'm really excited for this journey we're about to take.
Well,
I,
thank you.
yeah. So the first segment, just a couple of questions. And it's called What Comes to Mind. So you just let me know first thing that pops into your mind, and yeah, we'll go from there. So what comes to mind, Ed, when you hear the word vulnerability?
Yeah, I hear vulnerability and I see that as your willingness to open yourself both to yourself and to others, let others see inside you, take a look inside other people. You don't necessarily have to agree with what's there, but at least look and think and make an informed decision at that point.
Yeah, I love that. I love what you started with looking inside yourself. And I think that's hard for people to be vulnerable with themselves and be honest and true and open with themselves. So that's really good. What do you do to center yourself if you're feeling chaos, stress, depressed? What do you do to center yourself?
Yeah, fortunately, I don't get depressed very much, but
Good.
yeah, I'm fortunate that way. I live a pretty good life. I've been blessed. But the thing that gives me the greatest comfort and relaxation is really getting outdoors. I'm up early every morning, and I'll go and I'll walk any place from 2 to 7 miles.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And we live in a place called Hillsborough, North Carolina. There's a river that kind of snakes through town. It's not much of a river, but several years ago they built what they called a river walk along it. It's a path that follows the river, and I'll get out there, and you see deer, you see birds, you see other people with their dogs, and the nice part is if you go any place at the same time.
Mm.
uh, reliably, you start to meet people and know people. And, so in addition to the river walk and the relaxation of the walking, there's company out there.
There's community. Ooh, I like that. That may be the secret to why there's little depression in your life. We got to get up and walk in the morning. I like that. That's
There you
beautiful.
go. Not everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah. When you say early, what time are we thinking? Because I tell my brother tells me early, and it's like noon. So like,
That's yeah, I'm typically up someplace between 5 and 6.
there we go. That's
And
early. I
I'll
like it.
make myself breakfast. I'll take a little bit of time to check my email and then get dressed and go out and I'll get my walk in and then I've got three different stops depending on the day of the week and I'll stop for a cup of coffee and maybe a pastry or something.
Yeah.
And
Oh
same
man.
thing, if you go to those same places on the same days, you meet the same people and the community just gets bigger.
Yeah. I love that, Ed. I love it. What is one of your favorite childhood memories?
We used to go out to my grandmother's house, and she lived on Long Island in New York. And she she was first generation Ukrainian. So she had a big garden. I suspect that, the people before her had been peasant farmers. So she had a big vegetable garden, but down the side of her property, there was a wire fence and there were raspberry bushes. And in season, I remember we would go out there. I would be the first one out of the car, over the picket fence, and right to those raspberry bushes and start picking and start eating one at a time. And I still taste those raspberries.
Wow, wow. Oh, that's amazing. I love it. I love bringing that image to mind. That's really cool. You grew up in New York. Can you tell us what that was like? What year you were born and how old are you today, Ed?
I'll be 77 in May.
Let's go. Yes.
Yeah. So I was born in 1948.
Yeah.
I was adopted at birth. My adoptive parents took me home from the hospital at 1 day old. And then there's a period of time where the courts are involved and they make you a foster child, and then 18 months later, assuming everything has gone well, they would then approve an adoption.
Hmm.
So yeah, I grew up around New York City. Yeah, New York City has five boroughs. I grew up in Queens, which is probably the easternmost borough.
Okay.
Around high school time, moved into Midtown Manhattan, though, and lived on the corner of 55th Street and 6th Avenue. And there's no more central place in New York City.
Nice.
And it's just amazing. It's an amazing place to spend those years. Uh, I would come home from school. I would get my baseball stuff and go walking up the street to Central Park to play baseball there. And back then, you could walk up 6th Avenue with a baseball bat over your shoulder and nobody bothered you.
Yeah.
Now I suspect you might get arrested for it.
Yeah.
Or go downtown. There was a great music scene down in Greenwich Village, and so it was a wonderful experience.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And you mentioned your so you were adopted at birth
I
and
was.
did you ever get to meet your biological mother or your biological
Sadly, I
family?
didn't. I embarked on this search that the book is about, and I waited a very long time, and I waited as long as I did because I just had a wonderful adoption experience.
Yeah.
And I could tell you there are a lot of people out there who do not.
Mm-hmm.
Adoption is a very fraught subject at the moment, and I think I probably benefited because, I was adopted so long ago.
Yeah.
And so I think the direction that parents received back then was different. Uh, Not having social media was probably a very good thing
Yeah.
because I tend to think now, with social media, you know, it gives people a place to vent. And I think the more they talk about how bad things are, the worse they get.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had some adopted friends. It was quite by accident that I found out, but it was a period that preceded what they called the baby scoop era.
Mm.
And that's where, you know, women who unexpectedly became pregnant were forced, in most cases, to surrender children, and then the
Mm.
children were placed into adoption. And and that's what I had always assumed my situation was. From when I started the search, I found out it was quite a different situation.
It was different. Yeah. We're gonna get there, but I wanna know at what age did you find out that you were adopted, and how did your adoptive family treat that experience with you?
To my recollection, and this is, it's now almost 77 years, my parents and I never had a discussion about my adoption.
Oh wow.
I I always joke that some kids, spend their time going through their parents' liquor cabinet. I sort of went through my parents' file cabinet
Mm.
and I found an envelope with my mother's name on it. And
Whoa.
I opened it up and looked at it, and there were documents in there. One was something called Certificate of Birth by Adoption. And this is a New York City form. And
How old were you at the time?
I'm thinking 7, 8 years
Okay.
old,
Okay.
somewhere like that.
Uh-huh.
And I intuitively knew, most kids probably don't have one that says by adoption,
Yeah.
but that certificate basically took an essentially nameless child
Mm.
and gave him his adoptive parents' surname.
Mm. Wow.
And the other document that was in there turned out to be my adoption decree. And I remember looking at it at the time, and it had both my parents' signatures on it. It had the signature of a man named Francis Carberry,
Mm.
who, for whatever reason, I recalled as being my parents' lawyer,
Oh
and
wow.
had still one other name, which I didn't recognize at all.
Yeah.
And I took those papers, I folded them up, I put them back in the envelope, put the envelope back into the file, and sort of took the approach that my parents were not talking about this, and I guess I wasn't supposed to ask about it.
Mm, wow, wow. Having now gone through the discovery of all of that and then digging up even more research, what do you think or what would you have hoped your parents had done in that time period in your life when you were a child? Do you wish you had been communicated and understood a little bit more?
It's hard to look back and say I wish something was different because I can't imagine having had a better life.
Mm-hmm.
And my concern is if we had that discussion, it would have screwed everything up. And that's not what I wanted. Periodically I would think about those papers and
Mm-hmm.
and say, I wonder what that really means. And probably somewhere around that same period, I think I was 7 years old. My parents took me on vacation in Europe, and we were in France, and we went to an orphanage. And as I recall it, I asked, "How come we're going to an orphanage?" And I get an answer something along the lines of, "Well, wouldn't you like a little brother or sister?"
Oh wow.
And even at that age, I'm thinking, well, why don't you just make me one?
Yeah.
And the other thing was I am perfectly happy being an only child, and I was an
Yeah.
only child. I grew up alone.
Yeah.
And for
Yeah.
whatever reason, perhaps it was their age at the time, they were not able to adopt. So I had the experience of growing up as an only child.
Yeah, yeah. Which is I'm not the only child, but I grew up feeling like the only child for a really long time. I was 10 years older than my sister
Yeah,
and
that's a big
15,
difference.
yeah, and 15 above my brother. And so so much of my identity had been established in
Right.
those early formative years to where I was doing a lot by myself. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed being alone. And but yeah, that's interesting. And when you said the Ukrainian grandmother, was that the adoptive grandmother on the adoptive parent side?
Yeah, she was my adoptive mother's mother.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, and it
Well,
was kind of an interesting heredity because, as an adoptee, yeah, my adopted father was Sicilian and my mother was Ukrainian. So it's kind of it was an interesting mix.
Yeah, yeah, that is cool. I like that. I like that. That's the melting pot that New York City was at the
Absolutely.
time.
So both from the Lower East Side.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious. So at the age of 69, you decided that I gotta go do some research and figure this stuff out. What prompted that, and what have you uncovered?
What prompted it was I had read, and I think I was on my second or third reading of it,
Mm-hmm.
a book called The Lost, The Search for Six of 6 Million.
Mm,
And it was written by a man by the name of Daniel Mendelsohn, who's quite a prolific author. He writes nonfiction. He's actually a scholar in Greek tragedy.
mm-hmm.
And he went on a journey to find out what happened to six distant relatives who had perished in the Holocaust.
Mm.
And on a general level, he knew precisely what had happened to them. He wanted to know specifically.
Yeah, wow.
And he, because of his stature, I think, as an academic and as an author, he likely landed a pretty good size advance for his book that followed.
Mm-hmm.
And he traveled around the world twice, tracking down people from a tiny Ukrainian village who may have known his distant great uncle and his great cousins. And he ultimately, found out precisely to the time and to the place what happened to them.
Mm.
And it's
Wow.
an amazing book, and I
Wow.
still recommend it to people. And I read that, and we were in a cemetery up in New Jersey where my adoptive mother's family was all interred.
Mm-hmm.
And I was standing over the gravestone of the grandmother who I mentioned
Mm-hmm.
and her husband who had passed many years before. And I was looking at that and saying, you know what, if Mendelssohn could go around the world twice, now with ancestry.com and everything else, I bet I could find out more about these people.
Mm.
And because they were my family. And I
Yeah.
was curious, that whole, the Ukrainian connection was very interesting. So when we got back home to North Carolina, I went to our local library. They had an institutional version of ancestry.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I went and I typed in my grandmother's information and my grandfather's information. And I was rewarded with a wealth of information, about the time they got here, where they lived.
Wow.
I found out that they lived in an apartment right over what is now a Starbucks in the Lower East Side. Then they moved to the Bronx. Then they moved to Long Island. And I sat and I said, gee, if it's this easy, I still have that piece of paper at home, my adoption decree.
Mm.
And now, I intuitively know that one signature on it that I didn't recognize
Mm.
had to be my birth mother.
Wow. Wow.
So I went home, I got the piece of paper out, I wrote down the name, went back, and that's where it all began, really.
Wow. Wow. So I'm assuming this is after your adoptive parents passed away, you were able to obtain that document and keep and hang on to it
My
for this.
mother held on to it forever, my adoptive mother,
Uh-huh.
and I suspect she held on to it knowing that
Hoping you.
one
Hmm.
day I might want to know. And I was very privileged in that my adoption was privately arranged.
Mm-hmm.
And in most states, and New York has eased up in the past several years, but in many states, birth records are sealed tight
Yeah.
and adoptees cannot get to them. Had that been the case,
Wow.
I would never have had a place to even begin. But I was privileged to have a piece of paper with my mother's name on it.
Wow.
And when I plugged that name back into Ancestry, when I went back to the library, yeah, that's where it started to roll out to me.
I'm curious, what were the most surprising revelations that you learned about your birth mother's life when you started to uncover cover some things?
Yeah, as I said, My first thought would be that I was one of those baby scoop era kids
Hmm.
who had a mother who stayed out after the prom and unfortunately came back pregnant, got sent
Yeah.
to Aunt Martha's house where they
Yeah.
where they hid her for, for however many months. And then I was put into the system.
Mm,
But what I found out was that was not the case at the time she gave birth to me. She was 23 years old.
mm.
And through deduction and a series of just very lucky connections, I found out that my mother was a celebrity performer in the big ice skating shows that were so popular in the 1940s.
Wow.
The first document I pulled up when I put her name into Ancestry was a visa application to go from Miami, Florida to Rio de Janeiro.
Wow.
And I pulled
Okay.
that one up because it was the one that was dated closest to my birth. And it was written all in Portuguese because that's what they
Hmm.
spoke in Rio. And yeah, it listed her profession as an artista. And we just pondered what kind of artista. And ultimately I met a woman who was an antique dealer. And this is where the story got really complicated. But through that woman, I found out that my mother had been an ice skater. So when I plugged her name, I went and Googled her name with ice skater.
Hmm.
And then I found another woman with the blog online who probably had half a dozen of my mother's promotional photos on the blog, plus my mother's middle school diploma,
Wow.
plus my mother's first professional contract. And it was just one thing after another.
So she was a big deal. She was like for someone to keep that for all this time, she was a big deal.
Yeah, she was a big deal in her time. Ice skating was a very, very popular thing in the 40s and 50s, particularly,
Hmm.
because not everybody had a television set yet. Uh, and if you had a TV, you didn't have the 68 different channels to choose from.
Hmm.
So ice skating it was music and it was dance and it was colorful and people just flocked to it.
Yeah, yeah. Oh wow, that is beautiful. I'm curious what the emotions were like. What came up for you as you were uncovering all these different layers of your birth mother and understanding what her life was like? What emotions came up for you?
I think the first really right between the eyes, emotion was, when I pulled up that first document, the visa application, it was accompanied by her photograph.
Mm,
So on one piece of paper, I had all of the stuff about, what was her address and what was her age and were her parents' names. The other side was just a sheet with her picture on it. And I looked at it and I said, boy, this is it. And I kept on looking for the similarities, and I honestly didn't see them. I
mm-hmm.
sent the picture home to my wife though and said, "Oh, that looks just like you, and it looks just like James, their son." But it's funny. I recently got a photograph of her when she was later in her life, probably already into her 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Now I see that. Now I see the resemblance. She
Yeah.
also had a receding hairline, I think.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
but I think as I said, I had an ideal adoption experience.
Yeah.
So I didn't have any compelling need to know.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have any anger or feeling like I had been abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
So I was fortunate that I could go into the experience kind of open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found as I searched was a real profound appreciation for what a birth mother, and not just her, but any birth mother, must go through
Yeah.
in one, making the decision to give up a child,
Yeah.
number two, handing that child over, and then number three, in the days and the months and the years that follow that. And
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of what led to the book that I'm currently working on, is just that, the appreciation for for what a birth mother goes through.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. That's a tremendous experience. The perspective to even think through and think about, because you build so much empathy and compassion for that birth mother, those birth mothers who are faced with the choice or with the decision to make to give up their child. And it's not an easy one
And
for
it's some of those, early in the adoption era, that baby scoop era, a lot of those women didn't have the choice.
wow.
It
I
was
can't even
dictated for
imagine.
them. It's, you're gonna have your baby, we'll keep you here for another couple of weeks. The baby's going somewhere else.
Wow. Wow.
And I've met a lot of those ladies, and it's just kind of it's a very tough thing, and very few of them have told me that they don't think about that child,
Mm-hmm.
some of them
Yeah.
every day of their life since.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure it'd be torture to do so. Were you ever able to find any reason as to why your mom uh put you up for adoption or anything like that?
Well, I think it was several pieces. Number one, it was the era.
Mm-hmm.
A single woman in 1948 with a baby would be ostracized. It was just shame and humiliation and embarrassment.
Wow.
Um, my mother's career was ice skating.
Mm-hmm.
And she already was making very good money doing it. Had she given me up, she could not have gone back to ice skating. They
Yeah.
they would not have accepted her back.
Yeah.
So she would have wound up working at the Five and Dime or something.
Yeah.
And that was not a good answer. She wanted more for me.
Mm-hmm.
And the other option, I guess, had they taken her back for ice skating, she could have stuck me in a backpack and dragged me all around the country and the world with her. And she just didn't see that as the right option.
Yeah. Yeah. Did
And
you
through deduction, yeah, I really believe she came up with a list of, she arrived at the decision she would place me for adoption,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
I'm
then
sure she
came
was
up
very
with a
thoughtful.
list. Yeah, then came up with a list of what she wanted my adopted parents to be able to provide for me.
Mm. Wow.
And she just nailed it on the head, or my adopted parents nailed it on the head.
Yeah, that it sound like it makes sense when you say you had, the perfect adoption story because so many pieces were put together to see that you got what you needed.
Yeah, I
And
don't think it was an accident.
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't think it was
No,
a matter of luck.
that is beautiful. Did you ever pick up ice skating in your life?
Everybody always asks that, and I always say, well, I had weak ankles. But my son James is a very accomplished ice skater. Uh, he played ice hockey at a pretty high level through his college years,
Okay.
and still plays on Sunday nights in an adult league. And before this all happened, he met his now wife, who just happens to be a certified figure skating coach.
Oh, wow.
So I always say things happen for a reason. I don't think that's an accident either. I think the
No.
genes just hopped there.
Yeah, oh, that is amazing. That is so cool. Kudos to them. Did you ever find any other family members that were connected to your mom in your research?
Well, I did, yeah. I spent a lot of time just trying to find out, was she alive?
Mm-hmm.
And I ultimately met somebody who confirmed for me, who had grown up in their same neighborhood down in rural Georgia. Actually,
Mm.
this was in the Atlanta area, and then my mother, her then husband, and their two sons moved out to a farm in rural Georgia. But this friend told me that no, my mother had passed away, and I started my search in 2017. She passed away in 2014.
Okay.
So had I not waited quite so
Wow.
long, yeah, there may have been a reunion. But he put me in touch with one of the two brothers. The other brother had unfortunately passed away under kind of unfortunate circumstances. But yeah, I made contact with my half brother, maternal half brother, and it took a very, very, very long time for me to explain to him and then convince him that he and I had the same mother. He just, he asked me on 3 or 4 different occasions, tell me one more time, what kind of kin are we?
Wow.
And I would say, you and I have different fathers. We have the same mother.
That's hard to fathom if you didn't grow up with this brother next to you. Like that's
Yeah,
really hard to
and
fathom.
I've said it, had I found out my mother was alive, I would have taken a lot of time thinking about how do I approach this woman?
Mm-hmm.
After 70 years, how do I walk in to a room and say, hey, you may remember me. But when I found out she had passed away, I sort of assumed he would take the same kind of interest that I did. So I just came bombing in. And it took a while. And I thought, it was really kind of sweet because he had our mother up on a pedestal. He could
Yeah.
just not possibly fathom his mother had had an illegitimate child.
Yeah. And so
And
he
but
was
once,
younger than.
once I convinced him, yeah, that was fine. Everything's good.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he was younger than you, correct?
Yeah, he was born in 56, so he's 8 years younger than me.
Okay.
And his
Okay.
brother was born in 58. My mother ultimately got married in 1955.
Okay. Okay.
I was the product of a summer romance.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about the father? Did you ever find any information on that?
Yeah, I went on even before I started this search, I went the Christmas prior, I bought some DNA kits. So every time I buy my wife something, she returns it and says it doesn't fit. So I said, okay, DNA kit has to fit everybody. And she ultimately told me she was too busy to spit into the tube, but she did ultimately. But I sent mine right in, and somewhere in the midst of my search, when I already knew about my mother's family, I got my results back. And if you've done DNA, or anyone who has, you get a list with a couple of thousand distant relatives.
Mm-hmm.
And you get your heredity, which was quite different than my Sicilian roots. But at the top of the list of relatives was listed, I think, as first cousin, close family,
Mm-hmm.
and a name that I knew was not on my mother's side.
Wow.
And I was very excited. I said, okay, this may take me to my father then. And I said, if he's my first cousin, then he's got an uncle somewhere who's my father. And fortunately, he had a rather large family tree online, and I think
Mm.
he had one uncle and 6 aunts, something like that. So I said, bingo, I've got my father. So I
Wow.
reached out to the person who I matched with, and happily he responded, almost immediately. And yeah, he was offered, he gave me a little bit of background, offered to help with whatever he could. And I sent him back saying, this is what I'm thinking. Said, I think it's your Uncle Harris. He's got to be my dad.
Mm.
And a little
Wow.
while later, I got another email back saying, it's your logic is perfect, but I can tell you Uncle Harris never left Texas, and you're saying you were conceived in San Francisco. And I can also see that you're 25 or 30% Jewish. Uncle Harris doesn't have a lick of Jew to him.
Mm.
He said, but let me tell you what I'm thinking. Said, my father was half Jewish.
Oh my
He
goodness.
said, you and I are half brothers.
Stop.
And that's exactly what it was. And it's you hear the stories about people who you match with who will never talk to you and never help with information. He said, this is wonderful. I always wanted a brother.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
So, he was able to tell me a lot about my father. He was 9 years, 19, 7 years older than my mother at the time I
Okay.
was conceived, and obviously always 9 years or 7 years older than my mother.
Yeah.
At the time that I was conceived, our father was between the second and third of his 5 wives.
Oh wow.
So he obviously had some element of charm to him. But yeah, it's interesting. Both on my maternal side, I've been in touch with was somebody who knew my mother and her husband very well. And on the
Mhm.
paternal side, yeah, the feedback I've gotten almost word for word is I don't know where you grew up or with who, but you probably did better with them than you would have with,
Mm. Wow.
either on either side.
Yeah, that'll give you a lot of appreciation for the
Yeah,
experience.
you can't be any more grateful than that.
Wow, wow. That is amazing. And so you have chronicled this journey how do you describe your book? It's part memoir, but it's also part
Yes, the
creation.
first book interleaves memoir, which is the story of my search and all the elements of the search. And I suppose it's probably his creative nonfiction
Mm-hmm.
because what it does is it reconstructs my mother's travels from the time that she left home pursuing her career. She was 17 years old, and her parents put her on a train in New York City and let her travel 3 days to go to British Columbia to begin her career.
Wow.
And then 5 years later, she came back unexpectedly pregnant and sequestered herself. She managed the pregnancy and my adoption pretty much in total secrecy.
Wow.
And I know precisely where she was, when she was there, and who she would have been with. So I can be very accurate about her travels. The one
Mm.
thing I don't know is, when the two of us talk, what got talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But you
Yeah.
sort of start at one point and say, okay, if she was doing this, and then the next thing you know, she was doing that, you can pretty well figure out what took place in between.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
dialogue and such is created, but it's very accurate.
Wow, wow, that's very interesting and really creative to be able to take that story and put the pieces of the puzzle together like that. That's really cool.
Yeah,
What
it's neat that it sort of interleaves, one piece weaves in through the other.
yeah, yeah. Do you have a background in writing or what sparked like writing a book is an endeavor. I know like it's an endeavor. And so like where'd that come from?
Well, I think I've always had a way with words.
Mm-hmm.
I always kind of tease that, I worked for an airline that went bankrupt 3 times.
Mm.
And so 3 times I had to explain to the employees, and I would have to explain pay cuts and things like that. So I had a background in creative writing.
Yeah.
I could tell you why a 10% pay cut is going to be good for you. So I had that. I'd written a couple of, I was a fly fisherman. Yes, I wrote an article about fly fishing for a magazine. I had showed horses for a while. I had an article about Appaloosa horses published. They were small things. My wife just saw something one day
Mm.
in a newsletter saying the library has a memoir class.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Oh,
So
that's
I
nice.
so I went to the memoir class, and it was good from the standpoint of, we didn't meet frequently, but when we did, you had to bring something.
Mm-hmm.
So it disciplined me to start committing things to paper.
Yeah.
And then I got into this search for my mother and these crazy discoveries I was making. And I had a friend who's a writer who kept on telling me, you really need to write a book. You need to write a book.
Hmm.
So I started writing about the discoveries, and then all of a sudden, I had 90,000 words on paper,
Yeah.
not in any particularly good order. But then, I said, okay, I've got something here. So first I said, well, okay, let me make a two-part book.
Mm.
So part one will be the search, part two will be what I found out about my mother. And I decided to invest in a good editor, and she came
Mhm.
back and said, why don't we treat this sort of like a deck of cards and
Mm.
shuffle the two pieces together?
Yeah.
And that's what turned into the book.
Wow, wow, wow. I love that. I love it. It sounds like the library is a place of true discovery for you. You have found family members at the library. You found your writing at the library, and that's cool. So I'm pumping libraries. Go visit if you're listening
I
to this. Go
There's no better
visit your
place.
local
If it's
library.
not a bookstore, it's a library, so the libraries are
Yes.
free.
Yes, it's free and there's so many resources there. I have so ancestry and all of that is very complex and complicated for me as a young black person in America. My grandmother was very into it and she, built out all of her family trees on or her family tree online. But she was very disheartened. She got to, Aunt Fanny, who was alive when she was alive, and she's like, I can't go any further than that. And so, all the other relatives, it takes people to go out and to fill these things out, to find descendants of all of these different people and to do the swabs and to do all of that to really
Yeah.
connect the dots. Because without those different pieces of information, you don't have this story, you don't have this connection to your biological mother and father, and like so much of that is lost.
I
So
think the most difficult part, for an African American is the records are good to the point that you've come to America.
yeah, not even
And
not come to America freed from slavery. Yeah.
yeah, and I think in some cases, and with somebody who's adept at doing these searches, you can go well back from there. But unfortunately, Aunt Fanny's father may have been a number on somebody's roster.
Yeah.
Could have
Yeah.
been an initial and
Property.
an
Yeah.
age, and
Yeah.
that's a terribly hard thing.
It is, yeah, it's difficult. I think what she saw was, Aunt Fanny Everson was a black woman, and then above her was a woman, a white woman, Fanny Everson, and so it just flipped to the owners, and so
Yeah, yeah.
that yeah, it's difficult, but I think I'm always very curious and very interested in it, and I took a trip to Ghana, this past
Wow.
year, and that just like sparked my curiosity even more. And so I did a swab to see from africanancestry.com to see which, set of tribes, and it's a
Yeah.
mix of a whole bunch of different things, but I it came back Sierra Leone. And there's a specific tribe there in Sierra Leone that a lot of my DNA is originated from, which I thought was really cool. So I think it's just fascinating to learn more. I'm curious what your overall sense of identity or what you gain most and learn most about yourself through this discovery. What has that been like?
Yeah, I don't know that I changed a whole lot as a person. I think you said it before, and I take it as a great compliment. It's, it brought out a level of I've always seen myself as a compassionate person,
Mhm.
but it brought out I think an extra level there because, my mother was a stranger to me, my birth mother. She was total unknown quantity, but I feel like I know her quite well right now. And
Yeah,
my greatest regret in not having met her was the inability to say, thank you.
yeah.
You did something good for me and it turned out better than you could have ever imagined. And and the other part of the compassion is just meeting these other women who have given up children and there's this instinct that you want to go and hug them.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, and just say, I'm not sure what I'd say, but it's just, just that I have such an appreciation for what you went through, not necessarily what you did, but what you went through in doing what you did.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I
But it's
think
been a learning experience. It's sort of like opened up a whole other little compartment in my life.
yeah, yeah. Has it shaped the way that your family unit operates or how you communicate or anything like that?
No, it really hasn't.
Yeah.
My son is at an age and a point in life where, he said, "Oh, you wrote a book. That's nice." And, and he's met he's actually met both of my half brothers.
Mm-hmm.
So, so he's been part of that, and I think he appreciates that, but it's not a big part of his life. My wife has been a partner on this trip right from the beginning.
Yeah.
So that's been good. And we talk about, we've just added to the family. Unfortunately, we've lost a couple of family members on along the way, and we kind of jokingly talk about the new people as our replacement relatives.
Yeah. That's
And
good.
but we've it's been a very, very positive experience. And as I said in the beginning, it's not that way for everybody.
Wow. Yeah. True.
You read so much when you go into the online Facebook groups, about
Hmm.
people who feel they're rejected from the beginning, people who are not accepted at the other end. And
Hmm.
I'm blessed that I never experienced any of that.
Yeah, that is such a blessing, and I'm happy that you had the experience that you had, and it's
No,
created a
thank you.
human that you shine, like you exude like joy and brightness, and I can only imagine that has been a compounded effect of the amount of joy and goodness that has been poured into you from your adoptive family to the community that you surround yourself by. So it's really beautiful to witness.
No, thank you.
Yeah. I want to hop into a segment before we close out, and it's just a fill in the blank. And
Yep.
so, first thing, vulnerability makes me feel blank.
Being vulnerable makes me feel like a complete and understanding person, in that
Mm,
I understand myself and I attempt to understand others.
yes. Thank you. I love that. I love that. My biggest strength is blank.
I think my biggest strength is just the ability to live in the moment.
Mhm.
I don't fret over the past, and I don't know what's coming in the future, but I'm not going to get sick worrying about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I can sense that.
I can control today
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. If I could tell my younger self one thing, it would be blank.
Take better advantage of your education.
Yeah.
I was the classic underachiever in high school or in middle school as well. And I look back and there's so many things I'm trying to catch up on now. And I can look back and I know just where I was and what I should have been doing rather than catching up at age 77.
Yeah, yeah. This one just came to me. If my mom were still here today, she would tell me blank. Bio mom. She would tell me blank.
She would say, "Thank you, I'm proud of you."
Mm, I'd agree. I'd agree. Lastly, when I need inspiration, I turn to blank.
I turn to my family,
Mhm.
to my to my family unit, my wife, my son,
Yeah,
and my
yeah.
friends. I've got some close friends, and they keep you filled up.
Yeah, yeah. I am so excited for people to hear this episode and to learn more about you and the writings that you've put out into this world and just your perspective on life because I thought, when I read a little bit about the adoption and your search and all of this, like there are thoughts that come to mind that you think it's going to be one of those stories where it's like, man, I had resentment and anger and this, but to see how you have reframed the situation and found the beauty in you being the person that you are today because of this situation, because of the adoption, is absolutely beautiful and brilliant. So I thank you for being who you are. Are there any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience members?
Well, I guess they say that one out of every four people is in some way touched by adoption.
Mm, mm,
So either is adopted, has given a child up for adoption, has has adopted a child, or Aunt Martha has adopted one and you know about them. And so the community out there is actually pretty big. I think, it's from my perspective is just, if you're not happy with the situation, to step back from it and just give it some consideration. I think try to look at it compassionately.
Yeah.
And I think people are angry about what happens and they don't take enough time to think about why did it happen.
Yeah.
And in some cases, you may step back and say, "No, that's right. I should be angry." But I think in a lot of other cases, I think, if you'll give it a little bit of time and a little bit of breath, you
Mm.
find that, okay, maybe something else was going on that I didn't think about.
Yeah.
So it's just, and be kind to yourself. Yeah, that's
Mm.
whether you're adopted or not. Just be kind to yourself. Yeah, it's a tough world. It's a
Yeah.
messy world.
That's great. That's great. I'm gonna listen to that on like every morning. I just need to hear those words. Like, let's be kind to yourself. Thank you for that, Ed. How can people contact you? How can they find the book? How can they just keep up with what's going on in your life?
Yeah, well, I've got a website and it's www.digangiauthor.com. And that's Digangi. Uh, if you want to just reach straight out, you can email me at edward.dgangi, and I'll spell it again, Digan like Nancy, Gi at gmail.com. And I love to hear people's stories. I'm on Facebook. I don't post a terrible lot. I sort of run in spurts. Same thing with Instagram, and that's pretty much it. And yeah, I love to hear from people, love to share stories. And the book is available any place you can buy a book. It's The Gift Best Given, a memoir. The second book that's coming out, and it should be out by the beginning of or middle of June, is Gliding Through Goodbye. And that's a continuation of my mother's story. And it's a continuation which talks about what she experienced emotionally as she resumed her travels with her ice
Mm.
skating career. And I'm in a process of kind of putting the final touches on that. And that should be up on the website pretty soon, and then also available any place you buy books.
Yes, yes. Ed, it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you, my friend, and I'm looking forward to all of the future books and seeing what you do in life. It's truly remarkable with all the things that you could be doing and all the places you could be. I appreciate you being here with me, embracing
No,
vulnerability.
Reggie, I really appreciate the invitation to come and talk with you. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you for joining us in another episode of Vulnerability Muscle. If you've enjoyed these conversations around vulnerability, please consider leaving a review. Your feedback not only motivates us to continue to do the work that we do, but it allows other people to witness the power of vulnerability. Share your thoughts on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, or wherever you're listening from. And don't forget to spread the word. You can follow us at Vulnerability Muscle on Instagram and me personally at Reggie D Ford across all platforms. Visit vulnerabilitymuscle.com for additional resources and support. And remember, embracing vulnerability is not a sign of weakness. It is the source of your greatest strength. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, but most workouts are. So keep flexing that vulnerability muscle.